Hey you guys, it is me, Laura, with scrapsoфencouragement.com, and in case you missed my previous recent videos, this month I am focusing on sympathy cards because I need those in my stash, and I am also using my beautiful 12 by 12 designer series papers to create these cards with a panel on them that covers almost the entire card base. So today I'm working on one basic style of card, but I'm going to show you 3 ways to do it. And again, these are layouts that you can really use with any pattern papers that you have, or you can even create your own design. So this first card is really simple. I am starting with my 4 by 5¼ inch designer series paper, and I'm just going to glue that straight to the back of my card. I also have a scrap that is 4¼ by 1 inch. Now, the size of this scrap really depends on the sentiment or the stamp that you're using. So you'll want to cut it to fit whatever sentiment you have. This is the size that fit my sentiment. So I'm just going to take my Memento Tuxedo black ink and I'm stamping with Sympathy on that piece of cardstock, and I'm gluing that directly down to the front of my card base. That's it for the front. It's really simple. Then I'm going to carry that design over to the inside. I'm using a piece of 4 by 5¼ inch Whisper White cardstock, and I have cut a small strip of that patterned paper that I'm going to use and just lay on the inside of that panel. Just glue that down, and I'm going to snip off any extra that I have there, and then I'm just gluing this right down onto the card. Here's another one that I did with some different paper. I used the same stamp, just a little different color, and then on this one I also stamped a sentiment on the inside, which you can do as well. And for this envelope, I just drew a basic feather, which is a pretty easy thing to draw. For this card, I'm going to stamp a bird from a coordinating stamp set, and I'm going to use my blends to color that. So when I'm coloring with blends on an envelope, I usually like to stick a piece of cardstock on the inside so that it does not bleed through. I'm just doing some basic coloring and shading on this bird to kind of tie it into the rest of the card. And I am using colors that I'm drawing from that paper. I'm getting my coloring ideas directly from the pattern paper that I'm using. Finishes off this card. It's really simple, really easy, but it would just bring encouragement to someone going through a really hard time. For this next card, I'm starting out pretty much the same way. I'm using my pattern paper, I'm gluing that down to the back, and I have a strip of coordinating paper. Again, it matches the size of my sentiment. And then I have a piece of vellum that is slightly smaller than the colored strip. And so the vellum is the strip that you want to make sure will fit your stamp. And then I made the colored cardstock 1/8 of an inch larger on the sides. I'm going to take my powder tool and run that across my strip. And I'm using Versamark ink to stamp my sentiment because I'm going to heat emboss it. So once I have that stamped, I'm heat embossing this with white embossing powder. I like to come in with a tiny paintbrush, and anywhere where I have any embossing powder that has stuck and I don't want it there, I'll go ahead and get rid of that before I heat set it. And when I'm using little strips like this, I like to use tweezers because I find that I tend to burn my fingers if I don't. So I've just got some tweezers that I'm using to hold this while I heat set it. And then I'm going to center this on my strip and fold the edges over to kind of get my placement right. And then for this, I'm using some tape runner. I find that that works best to hold down vellum. So I'm just going to do a few little dots, and then I'm going to glue the whole thing onto my panel. So you can see how this is very similar to the one we did before. I just did some heat embossing and added a little layering. And then the inside of the card is going to be very similar as well. The only difference is I'm bringing in a little strip of that Mossy Meadow cardstock to give a border to that patterned paper strip that we're pulling in from the outside of the card. I'm just going to cut that down to the right size and glue it all together, and that's it for card number 2. card is very similar, but I'm adding an additional element onto it. And for this one, I am using a small sentiment. You can do this with a circle, you can do this with a square. I'm using an oval because it fits between the two birds on my pattern paper well. And I am going to be heat embossing my sentiment. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp that with Versamark ink, and I'm kind of stamping it down a little bit low because I am going to leave room for some flowers that I'm going to be stamping on there. I'm going to use again my powder tool and my paintbrush and make sure I have that all the way I need to. And then I love, especially when I'm using metallic embossing powders, I love watching that embossing powder turn all shiny with my heat tool. I am using some flowers. I do have the coordinating stamp set for this pattern paper. If you don't have one, that's totally fine. You can use flowers. You can use any kind of element you want that you already have. And I am going to go ahead and stamp some of these flowers around my sentiment. Now they're going to go off the panel. That's totally fine. And for this case, I've decided to add some leaves as well, just to bring a little bit more color in. And I'm going to heat emboss those as well. Once those are heat embossed and ready to go, I am bringing in some of my blend markers. And the colors I'm going to be using are Dark and Light Mossy Meadow, Dark and Light Daffodil Delight, and Dark Calypso Coral. And I got my colors from the pattern paper. I took my inspiration from what was already there, and I'm going to start by coloring the center of my flowers with the Dark Calypso Coral. I also pulled my blender pen because I'm going to pull out some of this yellow, which you'll see in a little bit. So then I am using my Dark and Light Daffodil Delight to kind of color the centers. I'm starting with the darker in the middle and then pulling that out with the lighter color, and then I'm using my blender pen to kind of blend that lightest color, yellow, out into the petals of my flowers. I'm also doing some simple coloring here. I am coloring it with the light one and then adding some shading in with my dark and blending all that together. The look that happens when you do any kind of coloring with the embossing is just really, really amazing. And I'm gonna do a little bit more heat embossing. So I decided to cut out a white piece of the scalloped oval that goes behind my oval, and I'm inking up the edges really well with the Versamark ink. I'm just running it in the Versamark ink, and then I'm adding my embossing powder. I don't really care as much about it being messy because I'm going to do this multiple times. I only really need to emboss the part that's going to stick out from behind the circle, but I want to make sure that that part is covered really well and not blotchy. So I'm going to do this a few times with my heat tool and my Versamark ink, my embossing powder, until I get it the way that I feel is good. I had a couple of spots that weren't cooperating, so I colored them with my Versamark pen, and then my embossing powder stuck to those much easier. So once I have all those pieces ready, I just have one more part that I am going to be heat embossing. So I am using this longer sentiment here that says "Our sincere condolences," and I am going to stamp that onto this sentiment strip and heat emboss that with the copper embossing powder as well. Now I'm going to glue it all together, starting with my panel, and then I'm playing around here to make sure that I like the copper scallop better than the Mossy Meadow one, and I do in fact like the copper one better. So I'm going to glue that together, commit, and get all of those elements on my card. I'm going to pop up that oval in the middle, and then it's time to move on to the inside of my card. So I'm doing a double panel here. I have a piece of Daffodil Delight paper that is cut at 1/8 of an inch smaller, than my card base size. And then I'm going to top that with a piece of 4 by 5¼ inch white Whisper White cardstock. But before I do that, I am going to go ahead and add more onto the inside of my card. So I'm using the Versamark ink again and those same flower stamps that I used on the front of my card. And I'm also using an additional sentiment. And while I have everything out, I'm stamping some of those flowers onto my envelope as well. And I'm going to go ahead and just heat emboss this all at once. Once my heat embossing is done, I am carrying the same coloring that I did over to my envelope. And you can do the inside of your card. I did a couple of these, and some of them I think I colored the inside of the card, and some of them I just left the inside of the card with the heat embossing outline, so you can do whatever you want here. So for this one I colored it exactly the same way that I did on the outside of the card as well. Then I glued all of those pieces together, and that was my finished card. Here's a few more that I did with the same basic idea. I did one with silver embossing where I just had the circle, and then I did one without a second layer, but I embossed the edge of the oval there. And then this one doesn't have any embossing on it, but I did cut out my stamped elements and made them 3D. So here is a closer look at some of the cards that we made today, and I hope that this was helpful for you. If it's not posted already, be looking in the next few days for a post on things to write in sympathy cards. Sometimes it can be very difficult to know what to say when someone has lost someone very close to them. So I will be posting that, and be sure to check out my blog post for a list of the supplies that I used in today's cards. And as always, I hope you find joy in creating as you spread kindness and encouragement with your scraps of paper. I'll talk to you later. Bye.